Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is tonight. As this video releases, Yom Kippur is kicking off. It's October 4th, 2022. Here where I live on the east coast of the United States, it kicks off about 6:15 p.m., somewhere in there, and it will go for 25 hours. It is the Jewish calendar year of 5783, and this is a video where we're going to scratch the surface on what is Yom Kippur, what did Jesus fulfill in it, but how is it different from the Passover? Because I think here in the West, I think a lot of Christians don't have a proper understanding of the two different holy days, what they mean, symbolize, where they came from, but more importantly, what Jesus accomplished and what they point to. So we're going to talk briefly and give a big overview and bring hopefully a lot of clarity to that. So I hope you'll stick around for this video. So the first truth, before we get into the nitty gritty of Passover and Yom Kippur, what they symbolize, what Jesus accomplished in and through them, and where they came from and what they point to, we just need to realize that the Old Testament, just about everything in the Old Testament, but especially the holidays and the feasts and the different things that we now have today that come from the Old Testament, were types and shadows of things to come or spiritual realities. Let's look at Hebrews 10:1, and it says this: "Since the law has only a shadow of the good things to come, and not the reality itself of those things, it can never perfect the worshipers by the same sacrifices they continually offer year after year." So what the author is saying here is, hey, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement that we're going to look at a little bit in the Old Testament, Passover, all right, these things, these sacrifices that are made in the Old Testament, they point to things that something that's going to come, because they can't actually accomplish for good what needs to be accomplished, which is the atonement of sin, and not just the atonement of sin, but as we're going to see in a minute, the utter removal of sin from God's people. So it's important to note that both Yom Kippur and Passover, as they were instated in the Old Testament, were to point to something. They were a type and shadow of something to come. So what the Jews think Yom Kippur is, and what Passover is, and what those two things mean, there's truth in that. Very, very much there's truth in that. And we'll talk about some of those things. But the fact is, it isn't complete. What they understand and what they believe the full meaning of these things are, while there's truth in it, it's not complete, because it's completed in Jesus. So we're going to look at both of those things as we move forward here. Now, since it's first in the story, the chronology, let's take a look at the Passover, okay? It's a spring festival, or Yom Kippur is in the fall, okay? It's a spring festival that is observed in remembrance of God causing the plague of death, which killed every firstborn male child in all of Egypt, okay? To pass over the houses, the families that had the blood of a slain, spotless lamb applied to their doors, okay? So first we have Israelites who are still living in Egypt when this lamb is slain. They're not removed from the corrupt society that they're living in, but even in the midst of it, God, instead of delivering them from it before the lamb was slain, he delivered them through it, okay? And so we can kind of see that pattern. I'm not going to go into the depths of that right now, but we can kind of see that pattern playing, all right? And so the Passover for the Jews is to remember and observe what God did in Egypt, because it's no doubt one of the greatest acts of God in their history, in this story. So they celebrate Passover in the spring in remembrance of that. Now, this lamb was to be without blemish, to be spotless, which symbolized purity. Ultimately, it symbolized being sinless. Okay, and so for believers, we can quickly start to pick up some of the language here and some of the similarities. But in Isaiah 53:7, which I want to draw our attention to here, Isaiah prophesies of the Messiah being like this lamb that we can see that was slain on the Passover. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, and like a sheep silent before her shears, he did not open his mouth. Okay, and we can see, those of us who believe in Jesus and the stories of the New Testament, we can so clearly see Jesus in this description. But for Jews who just look at the Old Testament, this no doubt foretelling of the Messiah points to the likeness of that lamb that was slain and his blood applied to cause the plague of death to pass over, okay, their homes, and spare the male firstborn children of the Israelites and all those who would have the blood applied. Okay, so I want to be very clear here. I want to note something. The Passover lamb, okay, the Passover lamb saved us from death. In this narrative, the Passover lamb saved us from death. It marked us and it sealed us, but it did not deal with why death was a reality in the first place, which is sin. Okay, so the Passover lamb did not deal with sin, okay, and it protected against the plague of death that came on the corrupt society that worshipped other gods and was abusing God's people. Now, let's move in and talk a little bit about Yom Kippur. So after the Israelites are set free through the miraculous splitting of the Red Sea, they're set free from Egypt, they move into the wilderness and make their journey onto the promised land. Now they spend 40 years in this wilderness, and during that time, God will give Moses a blueprint for the tabernacle. Now the tabernacle consists of the outer courts, the inner courts, and the Holy of Holies. Now the Holy of Holies is where God's manifest presence would abide on the earth. So this was referred to as Shekinah, his Shekinah glory, his Shekinah, right? So his physical manifest presence was on the earth. No one was allowed to enter the Holy of Holies except one person once a year, and that was the high priest, and that was on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The way this would work is that once a year, the high priest would sacrifice a bull to purify him and his household, and then he would be able to go into the high priest, in which he would take two goats. He would cast lots. The goat that was selected would become a sacrifice for the sins of the people of Israel, and then the blood from that goat would be sprinkled on the goat that was still alive, and then the high priest would pray and transfer the sins of the people onto that goat that was still alive. He would take this goat to what the Bible calls an uninhabitable place, which is just the wilderness. It's a desolate place where the goat would not be able to survive, but more importantly, it would not be able to get back to the people of Israel. So there was kind of this two-step process happening here. One is a goat was sacrificed for the sins. The other was the sins was transferred onto the living goat and removed from the people. So it wasn't just like a forgiving of sins. It was like an actual sin doesn't exist. Like it's removed from the people. And so there's kind of a two realities there, and they paint a picture of one, of something Jesus accomplished, but two, something Jesus will accomplish. Okay, so how is Jesus seen in Yom Kippur? Well, we're going to look in depth in the book of Hebrews here in just a minute, that Jesus was the great high priest. But first, let me show you something in Leviticus 17 real quick, and then in Hebrews, we'll jump into Hebrews 17:11, so 10 and 11. Anyone from the house of Israel or from the aliens who reside among them who eats any blood, I will turn against the person who eats blood and cut him off from his people. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have appointed it, this being the blood, to you to make atonement on the altar for your lives, since it is the lifeblood that makes atonement. Okay, so this is where this whole idea of blood and atonement come in. Now let's look at Hebrews 9:22. Okay, it says, according to the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Okay, and so that's where this comes from. But there's still a problem. Why are we having to constantly sacrifice over and over and over again? Why hasn't something been established that will deal with sin once and for all? Well, that's where Jesus comes in. Okay, he was the great high priest that atones for the sins. Okay, so he was the high priest, the sinless, pure high priest that didn't need to sacrifice a bull to purify him and his household. He was the sinless high priest that was able to enter the Holy of Holies, okay, and deal with sin. It was his blood that was laid on the altar that dealt with sin, and then he's going to remove sin from his people for once and for all. Let's read all the way through verse 28, and it will give us a great picture. Therefore, it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves to be purified with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with hands, only a model of the true one. Okay, so this is the author of Hebrews is saying the temple and the tabernacle, they were models of something in the heavenlies. Okay, so Jesus didn't need to enter those models that were just shadows. He entered the actual temple in the sanctuary in heaven that is not made with hands. Okay, he entered into heaven itself so that he might now appear in the presence of God for us. He did not do this to offer himself many times, as the high priest enters the sanctuary yearly. Okay, Jesus didn't have to do that over and over. He entered it with blood of another. So it wasn't even the high priest's blood. He took the blood of another. Otherwise, he would have had to suffer many times since the foundation of the world. But now he has appeared one time at the end of the ages for the removal of sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for people to die once and after this judgment, so also Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting on him. So we can see he appeared once, right? What Hebrews said. Not to bear, he bore sin the first time, but he's coming a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation. Okay, so he's now, this salvation is where we enter this reality where sin is not just atoned for, but it is completely removed. And so Jesus came the first time as the spotless lamb that was slain, but he's coming again as a king and as a lion to deal with sin and to deal with death once and for all by sending them to an uninhabitable, desolate place, the wilderness, where it cannot survive, but it ultimately cannot get back to the people of God. He's coming back as this lion and as this king. Here's what Isaiah prophesies in chapter 11, verse 4. But he will judge the poor righteously and execute justice for the oppressed of the land. He will strike the land with a scepter from his mouth, and he will kill the wicked with a command from his lips. Now, this is a stark contrast to the picture we see of the Messiah in Isaiah 53, where he's this innocent, quiet lamb led to be slaughtered. And for that reason, many Jewish people actually have speculation that they think that the scripture prophesies of two messiahs. They think some of them, this isn't all of them, don't accept this. Some of them think there was a messiah to come and die and then a messiah to come and rule. Okay, but we know that Jesus is coming back again. Okay, there's not two messiahs. Jesus is the Messiah. He came the first time as the spotless lamb to be led to the slaughter, all right, to protect, right, to seal us in him and protect us from the plague of death, all right, spiritually and then in a future sense. And then he also dealt with sin. He atoned, his blood was shed on the altar, sprinkled on the mercy seat, as we see in Leviticus 16. And he atoned for all the sins of those who would enter into covenant with him. His blood is the blood of this covenant, as Hebrews again really lays all this out. Okay, but he is coming back again, and there's an aspect of Yom Kippur that will be fulfilled at his second coming, and that's the getting rid of sin and ultimately death as a byproduct of sin once and for all. I know I didn't dive super deep and I didn't peel back all the layers to Yom Kippur and to Passover, but I hope this gives you a good biblical overview of the difference between the two, Jesus, what he accomplished in the two, and then what he's still going to accomplish, what they still foretell of that Jesus will accomplish at his second coming. So I hope this has been clear and concise. I hope this has added value to you and your understanding of what this holy day, Yom Kippur, is, and more importantly, what we have to look forward to and what we can choose to remember and observe during this Day of Atonement. I hope this has been helpful for you. Until next time, God bless.